The sound of a leaky faucet had become the rhythm of Emily Foster's lonely evenings. Every drop echoed through her quiet Portland kitchen like a reminder of everything that had slowly faded in her life. She had been married to David for 10 years, but lately it felt more like living with a polite stranger than a husband. They shared the same space, the same schedule, but not the same heart anymore. He worked late, ate in silence, and fell asleep before she could even say goodnight. Their laughter, once the soul of their home, had turned into a memory she barely recognized. On a rainy Tuesday, Emily finally decided to fix the faucet herself. The dripping was small, but the silence around it was heavy. She searched online and found a handyman service, Mason Carter, reliable home repairs. His profile photo showed a young man in his late 20s, smiling, with a confidence that seemed kind rather than arrogant. She hesitated for a second, thinking David would probably say she could have just waited for the weekend. But waiting had become her habit, and she was tired of it. She booked the appointment when Mason arrived the next morning. The rain had stopped, but the air still smelled like wet earth. He parked his old blue pickup outside and walked to the door with an easy stride. Emily noticed his calm energy the moment she opened the door. He wasn't what she expected. He was younger, late 20s, maybe with rolled-up sleeves and bright eyes that carried warmth. "Hi, Mrs. Foster. I'm Mason," he said, smiling. "Here to save your kitchen from drowning." She laughed lightly, surprised at how quickly he made her feel comfortable. Inside, Mason worked quietly, but with purpose. The sound of tools clicking and metal turning filled the air. Emily made coffee and offered him a cup. He accepted with a polite thank you and smiled again, simple. Genuine, the kind that made her forget for a moment how long it had been since someone looked at her with that kind of ease. They talked casually. He asked about the house, how long they had lived there, and where she got the beautiful plants by the window. His questions weren't forced. He seemed genuinely curious. Emily found herself telling him things she hadn't said aloud in years about how she used to paint. How she once dreamed of opening a small art studio before life got too busy. Mason listened, nodding thoughtfully while adjusting the wrench. "You should still do it," he said, not looking up. "Dreams don't expire just because we get older." His words landed softly, but they stayed with her. It took him less than an hour to fix the faucet. The dripping stopped, replaced by a steady silence that felt strangely new. He cleaned up his tools, and as he was leaving, he said something that made her pause. "You know, sometimes small leaks can turn into floods if we don't take care of them early." He was talking about the faucet, but his tone carried a deeper weight. Emily smiled faintly, unsure why that sentence stirred something in her. She watched from the window as his truck disappeared down the street for the rest of the day. She couldn't stop thinking about the simplicity of his words or the warmth in his voice. It wasn't romantic, at least that's what she told herself, but it was human. It reminded her of something she'd lost long ago. Connection. David came home late again that evening. He mumbled something about work and went straight to his laptop. Emily nodded, pretending to listen. The faucet was silent now, but her heart was not. Later that night, as she sat in bed beside her sleeping husband, Emily realized how much she missed being seen. Mason's kindness had been ordinary, yet it had filled a space inside her that had been empty for too long. She hated herself for noticing, but she also couldn't deny that a part of her felt alive again. The realization scared her not because she felt guilty, but because it made her question how long she'd been numb over the next few days. She went about her routine as usual: morning coffee, house chores, checking emails, but something had shifted. She caught herself glancing at the kitchen sink more than once, remembering that moment when the leak stopped. It wasn't about the repair. It was about how someone took the time to fix something that had been broken. She thought about Mason's words again. Small leaks can turn into floods. Her marriage wasn't in chaos. But it wasn't whole either. It was quiet, safe, and predictable, like a house kept clean but never truly lived in. She wanted to tell David about her day, about the handyman who fixed the faucet and made her laugh, but the moment she looked at him, scrolling on his phone, the words disappeared. So she stayed silent. Just like always. A few days later, Mason sent a short text thanking her for the coffee and asking if everything was still working fine. It was professional, polite, nothing more. Still, it made her heart lift in a way she couldn't explain. She typed back, "Yes, everything's perfect. Thank you." Her fingers hovered over the screen longer than necessary before hitting send. That night, it rained again. Emily stood by the kitchen window, listening to the steady rhythm of water outside. The house felt colder than usual. She wrapped herself in a shawl and thought about how strange life was that a stranger could fix a faucet and somehow awaken something inside her that her own husband hadn't touched in years. She didn't know what it meant or where it would lead, but one thing was clear: something inside her had shifted. It wasn't love. It wasn't even attraction in a physical sense. It was something simpler yet deeper. The reminder that she was still human, still capable of feeling warmth, joy, and curiosity. She had thought those feelings belonged only to her past, to the younger version of herself who believed in happy endings. But now, for the first time in years, Emily felt like maybe she wasn't as invisible as she thought. When she went to bed that night, David was asleep again, his steady breathing filling the room. Emily lay beside him, eyes open, listening to the sound of the rain. Her mind replayed Mason's voice, his smile, and that single sentence that refused to fade. Sometimes even small leaks can flood a home if we don't fix them in time. She didn't fully understand why it hit her so hard, but deep down she knew it wasn't about plumbing at all. It was about everything she had let drip away: her laughter, her dreams, her connection. She realized then that love doesn't die in one big moment. It disappears slowly, drop by drop, until one day the silence feels normal. And maybe, just maybe, the young handyman hadn't come just to fix her faucet. Maybe he had come to remind her what it felt like to be alive again. Days turned into weeks, but Emily couldn't shake Mason from her thoughts. His visit had been short, ordinary even, yet it left behind a strange warmth she couldn't explain. It wasn't that she was in love, it was that she felt seen. For so long, her life had moved like a quiet routine: work, home, dinner, silence. Mason had entered her world for just an hour. But somehow, his kindness lingered longer than any conversation she'd had in years. One Thursday morning, her phone buzzed with a message. "Hey, Mrs. Foster, just checking if the sink's still behaving. Hope all's good." It was short and polite, but it made her smile instantly. She replied quickly, "Everything's perfect. Thank you, Mason." He sent a thumbs-up emoji, and that was it. But the small exchange stayed with her all day, turning a dull morning into something quietly exciting. A week later, Emily noticed the back door hinge had started to creak. Normally, she would have ignored it or waited for David to fix it on the weekend. But without overthinking, she called Mason again. When he arrived that afternoon, she felt her heart race not with romantic nerves, but with a kind of anticipation she hadn't felt in a long time. Mason walked in wearing a light gray hoodie and a smile that felt as easy as the spring air outside. "Back door giving you trouble now?" he said with a grin. Emily laughed softly. "Guess this house is trying to keep you busy." Kai chuckled, then got to work. While he worked, they talked more this time. It wasn't just small talk, it felt real. He told her about how he'd started his handyman business after his mother passed away. "She taught me to build things," he said, tightening a screw. Said fixing small things gives you peace of mind. Emily listened closely, feeling the quiet emotion behind his words. She shared how she once loved painting, but stopped after marriage when life got too busy. Mason looked up from the door, his eyes calm but serious. "You should paint again," he said. "It's not too late to do what makes you feel alive." His words were simple, but they hit something deep inside her. That evening, after he left, Emily found her old paintbrushes tucked away in a drawer. The bristles were dry and stiff, but she smiled at them like meeting old friends. That night, she started painting again, a small vase of flowers. Nothing special, just something to remember what happiness used to feel like. The next few weeks became a quiet pattern. Mason would stop by every now and then, sometimes to check on repairs, sometimes just to drop off extra tools he forgot the last time. They talked about books, favorite movies, places they wanted to travel. Emily was surprised by how easy it was to talk to him. There was no pressure, no awkwardness, just understanding. She never crossed any lines. Their conversations stayed light and decent, but the emotional connection was undeniable. She felt more alive during those few hours with him than in months of living with David. Her husband noticed her. Good mood, but never asked why. He was too wrapped up in his work to see that she was changing. One afternoon, Mason helped her paint the porch railing. The sun was warm, and music played softly from her phone. Emily felt relaxed, almost happy. Mason looked at her halfway through painting and said, "You have a really peaceful smile when you work." She laughed. "It's been a while since someone said that to me." He paused, brushing off paint from his hand. "Then people around you need to start paying more attention." His tone was gentle, not flirtatious, but it stayed with her. That night, when Emily looked at her reflection in the mirror, she realized she looked different, lighter, younger, more present. The feeling confused her. It wasn't love. It was appreciation. Mason reminded her that she still had color in her life, even if her marriage had turned gray. As summer approached, Emily and Mason saw each other less. He was busy with other clients, and she didn't want to seem like she was finding excuses to call him. But she still thought of him often. Every time she saw the porch railing or the repaired door, a small smile crept across her face. It wasn't guilt, it was gratitude. One evening, while watering her plants, she noticed David watching her from the doorway. "You've been smiling more lately?" he said casually. She froze for a second. "Have I?" she asked lightly. He nodded. "Yeah, it's nice to see." He walked back inside before she could respond, leaving her with a swirl of thoughts. Maybe he noticed. Maybe there was still something left between them, buried under the years of silence. The next day, Mason stopped by unannounced. "I was nearby," he said, holding a small pot of flowers. "Thought your porch could use some color." Emily's heart softened. "You didn't have to." "I wanted to," he replied simply. They planted the flowers together, their hands brushing slightly as they worked. It wasn't intentional, but the moment felt charged with unspoken emotion. When he left that day, Emily sat by the window, watching the sun dip behind the houses. The flowers glowed softly in the golden light, and for the first time she felt both joy and guilt mixing inside her. She wasn't doing anything wrong, but her feelings were shifting in ways she couldn't control. That night, David came home late again. They ate dinner quietly. He talked about work while scrolling through his phone. Emily listened, nodding, but her mind drifted back to the sound of Mason's laugh. It's the way he noticed small things, the way he listened without rushing her. She hated that her thoughts went there, but she couldn't stop them. Later, as she cleaned the dishes, she looked at her reflection in the kitchen window. Her eyes looked softer, livelier. She realized it wasn't Mason himself that changed her. It was what he made her remember, that she was still someone worth noticing, worth hearing, worth feeling for. A few days later, she picked up her brush again and started anew, painting a porch with blooming flowers. Sunlight pouring over the railing. The colors were bright and alive. When David passed by, he stopped for a moment, watching her paint. "That's beautiful," he said quietly. It was the first compliment he had given her in years. She smiled, unsure what to say, but something about his tone felt sincere. As the evening light faded, Emily thought about Mason again. She didn't know why fate had brought him into her life, but she knew it had a purpose. He hadn't come to steal her heart, he had come to wake it up. The next morning, as she watered the flowers he brought, she whispered softly, "Thank you, Mason." She didn't mean it as a confession, but as gratitude for reminding her that even when life feels dull, a small act of kindness can make everything bloom again. And just like that, Emily realized something powerful. Love doesn't always arrive as romance. Sometimes it comes as a reminder of who you used to be, gently urging you to find yourself again. Summer arrived quietly, painting the city of Portland in soft golden tones. The flowers Mason had planted on Emily's porch had grown tall and bright, their petals opening every morning like they knew something she didn't. But Mason hadn't stopped by in weeks. His texts had slowed. His cheerful check-ins faded into silence. Emily told herself it was normal. He was busy. Life moved on, but deep inside, she missed his presence more than she wanted to admit. Her days returned to the same quiet routine. She painted in the mornings, cooked in the evenings, and waited for David to come home. Their marriage felt steadier on the surface, but emotionally, they were still strangers. He noticed her efforts, he thanked her for dinner, complimented her artwork, but the distance between them was still there, invisible, yet heavy. Emily tried not to compare his absence to Mason's warmth. But the human heart doesn't always follow logic. One afternoon, while she was in the grocery store, she saw Mason near the parking lot loading supplies into his truck. Her heart jumped. She hesitated, then called out his name. He turned surprised and smiled, though this time the smile seemed tired. "Emily, hey, how have you been?" They talked beside the truck under the summer sun. He looked different, more serious, quieter. She asked if he was okay. "Just been working too much," he said, rubbing the back of his neck, "trying to keep up with everything." She wanted to say she'd missed him, but kept her words safe. Instead, she smiled and said, "Well, the porch flowers are doing great. You'd be proud." He looked at her for a moment, his eyes gentle. "I'm glad. You've always had a good touch with things that grow." The way he said it made her chest ache. He wasn't flirting, he was just being himself. Kind and sincere, but that kindness stirred something too real to ignore. A week later, Mason texted again. "I've got an opening tomorrow. Need any repairs?" It was an offer she didn't need, but she said yes anyway. When he arrived, she made tea, and they sat on the back steps talking as the sun dipped low. Their words came easily, like they always had. But there was something different in the airway they both felt but didn't name. After a long pause, Emily said quietly, "You've been avoiding me." Mason looked down, his hands resting on his knees. "I thought maybe I should," he admitted. "You're married, Emily. I didn't want to make things complicated." His honesty cut through the calm. Emily's throat tightened. "You haven't done anything wrong," she said softly. "We're just friends." Mason gave a small, sad smile. "Are we?" The question hung between them like a quiet truth neither wanted to face. Emily looked away, her eyes stinging. "I don't know anymore." There was silence, broken only by the chirping of crickets in the yard. Mason stood, his voice low but steady. "You deserve to feel alive, Emily. You deserve happiness. But not like this. You shouldn't have to borrow it from someone else's kindness." His words hurt. Not because they were cruel, but because they were true. She wanted to argue, to tell him that what she felt wasn't wrong, it was human, but she couldn't. She knew that every smile, every shared moment was slowly crossing a line she didn't want to cross. Not because of guilt, but because she respected what they had. Mason had shown her something: reconnection without demands, warmth without expectations. That night after he left, Akoma sat alone on the porch with a cup of tea growing cold in her hands. She thought about her marriage, the quiet dinners, the untouched conversations, and realized she had been living half a life for too long. Mason hadn't tempted her into betrayal. He had shown her what honesty looked like. He had shown her the difference between being safe and being truly seen. When David came home that night, he noticed her silence. "You okay?" he asked, sitting beside her. It was the first time in months he had asked that question. She nodded, but didn't speak. Something inside her was shifting, a realization that she couldn't keep living like this. Halfway between love and loneliness. Over the next few days, she found herself thinking deeply. Not about Mason, but about what his presence had revealed. He had come into her life like a mirror, reflecting everything she had lost: her voice, her joy, her courage to feel. And now, standing at that emotional crossroad, she knew she had to make a choice. One evening, she decided to talk to David. It wasn't an argument, just an honest conversation, long overdue. "We've grown apart," she said gently. "I feel invisible sometimes. I don't want to blame you, but I can't pretend I'm happy anymore." David looked at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, she thought he might walk away or shut down like always. But instead, he sighed deeply. "I know," he said. "I felt it too. I just didn't know how to fix it." It was strange hearing him admit it. For years she thought he didn't notice. They talked for hours that night about the early days of their love, about where things went wrong, about whether they still had something worth saving. When Emily went to bed that night, her heart felt lighter, not because everything was solved, but because honesty had finally returned to their home. Still, Mason lingered in her thoughts. The next morning, she wrote him a message but never sent it. It simply said, "You were right. Thank you for reminding me to be honest with myself and with him." She deleted it, but she didn't need to send it to mean it. A few days later, she passed by the porch flowers again. Their colors were beginning to fade under the late summer heat, but they still stood tall. Emily smiled softly, realizing they were a lot like her, weathered but still standing. She didn't see Mason again for several weeks. But something inside her had changed permanently. His absence wasn't painful anymore. It was peaceful. He had entered her life like sunlight through a dusty window, bright and cleansing. He hadn't taken anything from her. Instead, he had given her back her own sense of worth. For the first time in years, Emily began to hope. Not for someone new, but for the chance to rebuild what was old, to rediscover love where it had once lived. Mason's lesson was simple yet profound. Love isn't always about holding on. Sometimes it's about letting go before you lose yourself. And though they never said goodbye, both of them understood something unspoken that day they had crossed a line neither wanted to break again. What they shared would stay between them, not as regret, but as a quiet, beautiful truth. When Emily looked out her window that night, the sky was glowing orange and gold. The light reminded her of the day she first met Mason, of his easy smile and gentle hands fixing the faucet. She smiled to herself, a tear slipping down her cheek, not of sadness, but of gratitude. He had come into her life to fix something small, but in doing so, he had helped her repair something far greater, her heart. Weeks passed quietly after that summer evening. The air grew cooler and the days shortened, but inside Emily's home, something had shifted. There was a stillness that didn't feel empty anymore, felt like peace slowly returning. She spent her mornings painting by the window, her evenings cooking small dinners, and her nights reflecting on everything that had changed. Life hadn't become easier overnight, but it had become honest. And honesty, she realized, was the foundation she had been missing all along. Mason hadn't reached out again, and she didn't expect him to. Their story didn't need closure in words, it already had it in meaning. He had stepped into her life to fix something simple and left her with a lesson that would last forever. But even as she tried to move forward, there were moments when she found herself remembering small things. His laugh, the sound of his boots on the porch, the way he listened without trying to fix her. Each memory carried warmth, not regret. One Saturday morning, while Emily was finishing a new painting, she heard a familiar knock. Her heart skipped once, then steadied. When she opened the door, Mason stood there, smiling shyly, holding a small bag of tools. "Hey, Mrs. Foster," he said lightly. "Just checking if the porch is still standing." She couldn't help but laugh. "It's fine, Mason. You didn't have to come." He shrugged. "Maybe I just wanted to see how your flowers are doing." They stepped outside together. The flowers were fading with the season, their petals dry and pale, but Emily loved them even more like this. "They've had a good run," she said. "Nothing lasts forever, right?" Mason nodded. "Maybe that's what makes it beautiful." They talked for a while, this time without the tension or confusion that used to linger between them. Emily told him how she and David had started talking, again really talking. She explained how they'd gone to dinner twice just to reconnect. "It's strange," she said softly. "We're learning each other all over again. It's not perfect, but it's real." Mason smiled, looking proud but a little wistful. "That's good. You deserve someone who listens, who sees you." For a long moment, they stood in silence, the autumn wind brushing past. Emily handed him a small, wrapped canvas. "I painted something for you," she said. "A thank you." He opened it carefully. It was the porch railing, bathed in sunset colors, with the flowers blooming bright. The scene looked simple, but the feeling behind it was deep. Mason looked at it for a long moment, his voice quiet. This is beautiful, Emily. You didn't have to. I wanted to, she interrupted softly. You reminded me who I am. Before you came, I'd forgotten how to feel, how to create, how to see color again. He looked up at her, his eyes kind but serious. You did that yourself. I just fixed a few hinges and a faucet. She smiled. No, Mason, you've fixed something bigger than that. For a second, neither spoke. The space between them was full of understanding. There was no hidden desire, no unspoken promise, just gratitude. Mason set the painting gently back in the wrapping. You taught me something too, he said. That sometimes helping someone doesn't mean changing their life. It means reminding them they can change it themselves. Emily felt tears in her eyes, but didn't hide them. I'll never forget you, Mason. He smiled faintly. You don't have to. Just keep painting. With that, he turned to leave. She watched him walk down the path toward his truck, the same blue pickup that had brought him into her life months ago. The engine started, the sound fading down the street until all that remained was the soft rustle of leaves. That evening, David came home early. He found her sitting on the porch, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. You're quiet today, he said gently. She nodded, then looked at him. I saw Mason, she admitted. David didn't look surprised. The handyman. She smiled slightly. Yes, he came by to check on the porch. David sat beside her. For a while, they both stared at the garden. Then he spoke softly. You know, when you started painting again, I realized how much I'd stopped seeing you. I thought we were fine, but we weren't. I'm sorry for that. His words were sincere. Emily turned to him, her voice steady. We both stopped trying, David, but maybe it's not too late to start again. He reached for her hand, hesitant but hopeful. I'd like that. For the first time in years, Emily felt something true bloom between them. Something small, fragile, but real. It wasn't the fiery passion of youth, but a quiet rediscovery of love that had been hiding under the dust of everyday life. That night, she placed Mason's painting on a shelf in her studio. Every time she looked at it, she didn't think of what could have been, she thought of what was. A friendship that awakened her spirit. A reminder that love doesn't always come to steal, sometimes comes to teach. As the months passed, Emily's home changed. The walls were filled with new art. The garden grew vibrant again, and laughter began to return. She and David spent more time together, not out of duty, but out of choice. They took walks, cooked together, even argued sometimes, but with care. They were learning to love each other again, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. One day, while cleaning the porch, Emily found a small wrench Mason had left behind. She held it in her hand, smiling softly. It was worn, but solid like the memory of him. She decided to keep it in her studio, not as a secret, but as a symbol. A reminder that even brief encounters can leave lasting marks on the heart. Years later, Emily's art studio finally opened in town. She named it the Porchlight Studio because she explained to visitors, light always finds a way back, even after the darkest nights. Her story wasn't about infidelity or betrayal. It was about rediscovery of hope, honesty, and the kind of love that grows when truth is finally spoken. Sometimes, she wondered if Mason ever saw the sign, driving through town on his way to another job. Maybe he did. Maybe he didn't. But she hoped he knew what he had started, a quiet change that rippled into something beautiful on her studio's wall. Above the entrance, she kept that same painting she once gave him, a replica she made after he left. The porch, the railing, the flowers, and the sunlight. It wasn't just art. It was a reminder that every connection, no matter how brief, can lead you closer to who you're meant to be. As she stood there one evening, watching the sunset light fill the room, Emily realized what love really meant. It wasn't about perfect endings or grand gestures. It was about healing, about choosing honesty over comfort, about finding color in a world that once felt gray. And though Mason was no longer part of her life, his kindness lived quietly in the lessons he left behind. She whispered to herself with a gentle smile, sometimes, Love doesn't come to stay, it comes to awaken. And in that truth, Emily finally found peace.